They thought they could fool him into giving them his land. They were wrong. Late February in West Texas carries light without weight. The morning's cool enough for a jacket but comfortable by afternoon. As the temperature moves steadily upward, the air dry and steady, the wind traveling low across open pasture and lifting dust in thin, patient ribbons that disappear before they reach the fence line. Wyatt was up before sunrise, as he had been for most of his life, standing on the porch with a mug of black coffee, watching the horizon shift from charcoal to pale gold. No emergency waiting for him, no distressed cattle. Just routine, and routine properly kept was the difference between control and surprise. He drove out toward the north pasture while the light was still soft, the herd already spreading toward water as he counted without consciously counting. A few calves staying close to their mothers, while one steer leaned a little too long against a fence post. Wyatt noticed it the way he always noticed the small imbalances first, the habit that had built his reputation more than any loud decision ever had. He was 56 years old, land wealthy, cash careful, and steady in ways that did not require explanation. A man who understood drought cycles, feed timing, breeding lines, and the long patience required to hold cattle through volatile markets. Land did not shout when something was wrong. It adjusted in inches, and Wyatt had built his life reading inches. That evening, the County Cattle Association met in town. The hall warm but not crowded, doors propped open to let the February air move through. Conversation starting where it always did. Rainfall, diesel prices, calf weights, insurance renewals. The familiar rhythm of men who understood that land moves slowly, and so should the words used to describe it. Then the projector lowered. A younger man began presenting on solar placement and grid storage, his boots clean in a way that suggested more conference rooms than corrals, slides glowing against the wall. Battery systems, energy arbitrage, federal tax incentives, long-term yield models. While he spoke about decentralized infrastructure and landowner participation with the quiet confidence of someone who had delivered this presentation many times before, he did not oversell, he did not hesitate. Wyatt sat still and listened, the room shifting almost imperceptibly around him. Not convinced, not dismissive, just attentive, until the presenter said, "The next decade will reward landowners who think beyond grazing." It wasn't delivered as a challenge, but it carried one anyway, and Wyatt felt something move inside him. Not greed, not urgency, something closer to awareness. Because he had spent decades surviving cattle cycles, adapting to markets, and protecting margin. And this conversation wasn't about survival. It was about expansion, about participation in something larger and faster than anything the cattle haul had discussed before. On the drive home, the truck rolled steadily over gravel, dust following in a low plume behind them, while Claire rested one arm near the window, watching fence posts pass in quiet rhythm, having listened closely all evening without saying much. After a mile, Wyatt said, "Feels like something's shifting." Claire let the silence sit for a moment before answering. "Maybe." He kept his eyes forward. "Feels like if you stand still too long, you miss it." She turned slightly toward him. He talked about returns before he talked about execution. Wyatt absorbed that, nodded once, and drove on. March moved into April with calving season taking priority. New life demanding attention in a way that keeps a man practical, the nights shorter and days fuller as Wyatt's focus returned to feed ratios, veterinary checks, and pasture rotation. But the investor invitations began arriving quietly alongside the routine. A regional energy panel in Midland, a private dinner after the panel, a banker requesting a conversation about strategic land participation. And Wyatt attended one event out of curiosity, then another. The rooms were different from cattle halls, softer lighting and lower voices, cleaner shoes, founders speaking quickly but with confidence. At the same time, valuations were mentioned without apology, and Wyatt introduced himself simply as a rancher. That word still carrying weight in those rooms, people leaning in when he said it. An ag tech founder approached him after one panel, speaking practically about soil monitoring systems, herd analytics, and data platforms built for ranch-scale operations. The conversation feeling connected to the land rather than replacing it, the numbers steady rather than theatrical. In late April, Wyatt wrote a check for $75,000. Not reckless, not transformative to his balance sheet, but changing something subtle in him, because he was no longer only observing the next wave. He had stepped into it. He told Claire that evening, as they stood outside watching the herd move toward water under a soft spring sky. "I put some money in," he said. She nodded, not startled. "Do you understand it?" "Yes," he answered, and he believed that, at least enough, while Claire studied his face for a moment longer than usual, before letting the conversation rest. By early June, the solar investment group opportunity appeared. Solar paired with battery storage on marginal grazing land, federal incentives structured to encourage early participation, institutional co-investors in conversation, the numbers projecting stability and the language projecting inevitability. The term sheet arrived on a warm evening, 40 pages of dense structure that Wyatt carried to the kitchen table, and began reading slowly. At the same time, Claire sat across from him with her own book open, though she turned a page less often than usual. He recognized financial numbers clearly, but did not fully recognize the governance language that sat in patient paragraphs, feeling written to be agreed to rather than understood. "It's standard," he said at one point, repeating what the founder had told him. Claire lifted her eyes. "Is it clear?" He hesitated only briefly. "Clear enough." Outside, the June air held steady and dry, summer building gradually without drama, heat in West Texas settling rather than arriving. And somewhere beneath that steady heat, something inside Wyatt had begun moving faster than the season. The Solar Investment Group's term sheet came to the ranch the way most things did, through Claire, collected from the post box 4 miles away at the roadhead, when she returned from town with the groceries, most of the mail routine, one envelope not. It sat clean and corporate against the worn timber of the kitchen table, the SIG name printed clearly in the upper left corner, where it could be read from across the room. Claire set it down without comment and began unpacking the groceries. Wyatt came in from the south pasture an hour later, washed his hands at the sink, dried them slowly, and saw the envelope immediately without reaching for it, pouring himself a coffee and standing at the counter looking at it from there. The company name readable from where he stood, the same name projected on a wall in a warm cattle hall back in February. He had not given them his address. He had not invited this conversation. He sat down eventually, picked up the envelope with both hands, turned it once, and opened it, reading for an hour without speaking, while Claire moved quietly around the kitchen before sitting down across from him, setting a fresh coffee beside him without being asked. He looked up briefly. "They sent this without being asked," he said. "I know." He looked back at the page. "I never gave them this address." Claire let that sit for a moment. "No," she said. "You didn't. Annie is coming early Saturday. She'll go over it." He finished reading as the light outside shifted toward evening, set the document flat on the table, and placed both hands on top of it. The ranch quiet around him, the herd settled, 4 miles of track separating this kitchen from the road and everything beyond it. It hadn't felt like enough distance tonight. Annie left Houston before the sun came up, the roads out of the city quieter before dawn, and the air conditioning working better when the outside temperature hadn't yet started climbing. Her F-250 holding the road without effort across 4 hours of highway and county road before the turn onto the ranch track. Miles of fence line running beside her as the truck rolled the last 4 miles at a steady pace. She had driven this track her whole life. Claire was already outside when Annie pulled into the yard, up since before first light the way West Texas women work. Get the hard hours done while the air is still bearable, then let the afternoon belong to the heat. Annie stepped out of the truck and Claire covered the distance between them without hurrying, the hug between them the kind that doesn't need explanation. Two women who had spent early mornings together in a horse trailer driving to rodeos across 3 counties, who had stood in arena dust and known without speaking what the other needed, who had never required a title to define what they were to each other. "You made good time," Claire said, stepping back and looking at her properly. Annie smiled. "Left before the city woke up." Wyatt came off the porch having watched from the moment the truck appeared at the end of the track, and Annie turned and walked toward him, the hug between them quieter than the one with Claire. Wyatt holding on a beat longer than usual without saying anything immediately. Neither did she. Some things between a father and daughter don't require opening words. They drove out to the western pasture together after breakfast, Annie in her truck with Wyatt beside her, the morning air still cool enough to keep the windows down as the truck moved slowly across the caliche ground. Wyatt had walked this section his entire life, knowing it would never graze well, the pale, hard-pan surface defeating root systems and holding water poorly. 3 generations of Callahans working around it and accepting it as dead ground that came with the property. Annie stopped the truck and stepped out, standing quietly for a moment with her boots on the caliche surface, looking south toward the horizon where the transmission towers carried their cables toward Midland. Wyatt stood beside her. "That ground has never earned its keep," he said. Annie looked across the flat, pale expanse stretching toward the southern boundary. "It's about to," she said. They stood there for a while without speaking, the way ranching people stand on land they understand, reading it in the particular silence that replaces words when the ground itself says enough. The transmission towers patient on the southern horizon exactly where they had always stood, waiting for someone to understand what they meant. Wyatt had looked at those towers most of his life without thinking much about them, and standing beside his daughter on caliche ground that morning, they meant something different. They worked at the kitchen table until the sun had dropped low enough to soften the light across the pasture. Papers spread across the worn timber surface in small piles, while Annie moved slowly through the lease, reading the way lawyers do when they're looking for what isn't obvious. Wyatt watched her for a while. "You're quiet," he said. Annie didn't look up. "I'm reading the parts they don't want you to notice." Jake leaned against the counter with his arms folded. "That usually takes longer." Annie flipped another page and rested a finger along the margin. "They wrote this well," she said, sliding the document across the table toward him and pointing to a paragraph halfway down the page. "They control the interconnection filing. Once that's filed with the grid operator, nobody else gets access to that connection point unless they approve it." Jake nodded from the counter. "That's the door." Wyatt looked back at the page. "So the land isn't the real asset." Annie shook her head. Jake spoke quietly. "The line is." The room stayed quiet for a moment while Wyatt thought about that, the wind moving slowly outside across the pasture, where the western fields stretched toward the horizon, and the transmission towers carried their long cables south toward Midland. And he had looked at those towers most of his life without thinking much about them, and now they meant something different for the second time in one day. He looked back at Annie. "What happens if we file first?" Annie leaned back in her chair. "Then the connection belongs to you." Jake pushed himself off the counter. "That changes the whole negotiation." Wyatt studied the map. "And the battery?" Jake answered without hesitation. "Bigger." Daniel had explained the numbers earlier that week. The solar companies design moving electricity straight to the grid during daylight hours, making the installation cheaper, but ensuring the ranch would never control the timing of the power, and an oversized battery bank changed everything. It allowed electricity to wait, and waiting meant choice. With 160 megawatt hours of storage instead of the developer's proposed 20, the ranch wouldn't be selling solar anymore. It would be selling timing, holding power until the Texas grid tightened at night, or drilling operations in Midland, pulled massive loads and stored energy sold at a premium. Annie closed the lease folder and pushed it aside. "They assumed you wouldn't want to deal with the legal work," she said. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "And?" She shrugged and rested her boots on the lower rung of the chair. "I grew up here," she said. "Paperwork doesn't scare me." Jake smiled slightly. "They also assumed he'd just leased the ground." Wyatt stood and walked to the window, looking out across the western pasture in the late evening light. The grass there, never as strong as the eastern fields, but stretching wide and open under the sky. And he could picture the panels now. Low to the ground, rows catching sunlight across acres that had never produced much grass anyway. And somewhere beside them, hidden behind fencing and steel housing, a battery bank large enough to store power until the moment it mattered. He turned back toward the table. "So," he said, "what's the first move?" Annie didn't hesitate. "We file first." Jake nodded once. "And then we design it properly." Wyatt looked at both of them, And for the first time since Sig had approached him, the deal finally made sense. Not as a lease, as an investment on his own land. "We file first," Annie said. And 3 days later, it was done. The paperwork prepared and sent through the grid operator's submission system before most people in the county had finished their morning coffee. And when the confirmation email arrived, she slid the laptop across the kitchen table without ceremony. "You're in the queue," she said. Wyatt studied the screen for a moment. "That's it?" "That's the hard part," Annie replied. "Now it belongs to us." Jake stood near the back door, looking out across the pasture. "That changes the timeline for everyone else," he said. 2 weeks later, Sig called again. The tone shifted from previous conversations, no longer asking whether Wyatt intended to sign, but whether he had submitted anything to the grid operator, and Wyatt answered calmly, "I'm looking at building something myself." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That would be complicated," the man said. Wyatt watched a group of cattle moving slowly across the eastern pasture, the silence holding between them. "We've already done most of the planning work," the man continued. Wyatt kept his eyes on the pasture. "I'm sure you have," he said. The conversation ended soon after. Daniel returned the following week with updated engineering drawings, spreading the plans across the hood of Wyatt's truck, while the wind moved gently across the western field. The panel layout working well across the caliche ground with the sun exposure clean and the slope manageable. But it was the battery diagram that changed the conversation. The developer's design would install roughly 20 megawatt-hours of storage, enough to smooth daytime output before sending it to the grid, making the installation cheaper but surrendering all control over timing, while Daniel's revised design showed 160. Jake gave a quiet whistle. "That's serious storage." Daniel nodded, pointing toward the transmission line on the southern horizon. "With that much capacity, you're not selling solar anymore," he said. "You're selling timing. During the day, the Texas grid floods with solar power and prices drop. But late at night or during sudden demand spikes, electricity becomes valuable. And in Midland, drilling operations cannot afford to stop." Jake folded the map and looked south. "Rigs pull massive power loads," he said. "If the grid tightens, stored energy sells at a premium." Wyatt crossed his arms and studied the pasture. "So instead of chasing sunlight," he said slowly, "we wait." Daniel nodded once. "And sell when the grid needs it." Construction planning moved quietly over the next month. Annie handling the legal filings and land use permits with the same efficiency she brought to everything, moving between corporate legal language and ranch practicality without much effort. And at one point, Wyatt watched her review a permit application at the kitchen table in her boots. "You still look like a ranch kid doing homework," he said. Annie smiled without looking up. "Just more paperwork now." Jake handled the technical infrastructure, integrating the new solar system design into the open mesh monitoring platform that already covered most of the ranch, so that panels, batteries, and the herd would all run through the same dashboard. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "You're putting cattle and power plants in the same system?" Jake shrugged. "Both depend on weather." Word moved through local energy circles faster than Wyatt expected, and it wasn't long before Sig discovered that the ranch had already filed the interconnection request. One afternoon, Annie looked up from her laptop. "They're trying to find out who's designing the system," she said. Wyatt leaned back in his chair. "Let them look." Jake stepped through the doorway carrying a small equipment case. "They won't like the answer anyway." Wyatt looked toward the western pasture through the kitchen window, the field that had produced little more than thin grass and occasional dust storms for most of his life, soon to hold something entirely different. Rows of panels catching the Texas sun, and behind them a battery bank large enough to decide when the power left the land. And Sig thought they were negotiating for control of a rancher's pasture. But what they were about to discover was that Wyatt had decided to become something else entirely. Not a landowner leasing ground, an energy producer choosing his own moment to sell. The first sign of pushback came as a letter, arriving folded inside a thick county envelope and sitting on the kitchen table while Wyatt finished his morning coffee. And Annie picked it up first, reading the heading slowly. "Planning objection," she said. Wyatt looked up. "From who?" Annie turned the page so he could see the name. SIG. Jake leaned against the counter and watched her read the rest. They're requesting an environmental review, she said. Wildlife impact, drainage, soil disturbance. Wyatt frowned slightly. For solar panels? Jake shrugged. They're not expecting to win, he said. They're expecting to slow you down, make the process annoying enough that you hand it back to them. Annie folded the paper closed and set it aside while Wyatt stood and walked to the window. The western pasture stretching out under the early morning sun, the grass still thin but steady across the caliche ground. Not happening, he said. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived, this one from the grid operator rather than the county. SIG claiming the local grid might not support the storage capacity and arguing that 160 megawatt hours could overload the connection. And Daniel read it quietly, set it down, and looked up. The grid can handle it, he said. This line feeds industrial demand south of here and was built to handle far more power than that. They're not trying to stop the project. They're trying to make you hesitate. The next pressure came as a phone call late in the afternoon while the sun hung low over the pasture. The same SIG investor from months earlier now prepared to nearly double the original lease payment. And Wyatt listened to the number without responding immediately, understanding the strategy clearly. Easy money, less trouble. Sign the lease and let someone else handle the infrastructure. I'll think about it, Wyatt said. That evening, the offer sat printed on the kitchen table, and Jake slid it back across the wood after reading it once. They doubled the lease. Wyatt nodded, and he looked at the number and shook her head slowly. They're not paying for the pasture, she said. Jake leaned back in his chair. They're paying for the interconnection. Wyatt folded the paper and set it aside. So the land is still the door. Annie smiled slightly. And you're holding the key. A week later, SIG made their first visit to the ranch. A black truck rolling slowly into the yard just after midday. 2 men stepping out in pressed shirts and polished boots that had never spent much time around cattle. And Wyatt met them near the barn and walked them toward the house, where the maps and engineering drawings still covered the kitchen table. The taller man stopped when he saw the room. Annie near the window reviewing permit filings. Jake leaning over a grid map on the counter. Daniel studying the solar layout beside him with a pencil moving slowly across the drawing. And for the first time since arriving, the investor hesitated. Wyatt noticed it. We've been doing some planning of our own, he said. The man recovered quickly. I see that. Jake looked up briefly. Grid capacity study came back fine, he said. Annie didn't look up from the papers. Planning objection didn't hold either, she added. Daniel tapped the engineering drawing. We're finalizing the storage design. The room fell quiet while the SIG investor looked around the table slowly, taking in the maps, the filings, and the diagrams spread across the worn kitchen wood. And they had come expecting to negotiate with a rancher, but instead had walked into a room that looked very much like the early stages of an energy company. Claire noticed the survey flags before Wyatt mentioned them, bright strips of orange ribbon moving slowly across the western pasture as the wind lifted them against the thin grass. Survey workers stopping every few yards to mark the next point along the caliche ground, and from the porch they looked like small figures moving carefully across land that had never drawn much attention before. Claire watched them for a while before going back inside, and the phone rang a few minutes later. She recognized the number immediately. Hi, Mom, she said. Violet didn't waste time. Claire, what is going on out there? Claire leaned against the kitchen counter. What do you mean? I drove past the North Road this morning, Violet said. There are men out on Wyatt's west pasture with survey flags everywhere. That ground has barely grown grass since you were a girl, and now there are trucks and survey crews walking around like they're building a highway. Claire looked out the window toward the pasture where the orange markers were still shifting in the wind. It's not a highway, she said. Then what is it? Claire hesitated for just a moment. Why don't you come for supper tonight? She said. Annie's here. She can explain it better than I can. There was a short silence on the other end. Annie's home? Yeah. Another pause, then. Well, Violet said, now I'm even more curious. Claire laughed softly. 6 o'clock? I'll be there. Claire set the phone down, and Wyatt walked in from the porch a minute later. That your mom? He asked. Claire nodded. She saw the survey crews. Wyatt smiled. That didn't take long. Claire leaned against the counter, suddenly looking less certain. She's going to ask questions, she said. She trusts you, but she's going to worry if she thinks we're getting pulled into something complicated. Wyatt walked over and rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. We're not getting pulled, he said. We're building. Claire smiled faintly, though the concern hadn't completely left her face. That's what I'd like her to understand, she said. Violet arrived just after sunset, her truck rolling slowly up the driveway as the evening light settled across the ranch, stepping out and looking immediately toward the western pasture, where the survey flags were still visible against the fading grass. Well, she said, walking toward the porch, that looks like more activity than that field has seen in 20 years. Claire hugged her. You noticed. Violet looked past her daughter toward Wyatt. I noticed things. Wyatt opened the door. Come inside, he said. We'll explain. Annie was already setting plates on the table when Violet stopped at the sight of the map spread across the surface. That doesn't look like cattle paperwork, she said. Annie smiled. It isn't. Violet pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. All right, she said. Someone start talking. Claire looked at Annie. Go ahead, she said softly. Annie nodded and turned the map toward Violet, pointing south toward the horizon. You see those transmission towers south of the ranch? She asked. They've been there longer than Wyatt's cattle, carrying electricity across half this part of Texas, and Wyatt's land sits closer to that grid connection than most of the surrounding ranches. Violet looked from Annie to Wyatt. So some solar company wants to rent it, she said. Annie smiled. They tried. Violet looked at Wyatt. And? Wyatt met her eyes calmly. We decided to build the project ourselves. Violet sat back in her chair and studied the three of them. The kitchen quiet for a moment, except for the soft sound of wind moving outside the windows, and then she nodded slowly. Well, she said, I suppose that explains the survey flags. Claire finally relaxed and poured the tea. Dinner's ready, she said. Outside, the wind moved across the western pasture, where the orange markers stood quietly in the fading light, outlining the beginning of something that had never existed on that ground before. SIG had done their homework on Violet the same way they had done it on Wyatt. A woman running a ranch alone on a fixed income, adjacent land touching the caliche ground they needed, no obvious succession plan visible from a boardroom, and they sent a man in a clean truck with a prepared offer and the kind of confident smile that plays well in conference rooms. He arrived on a Tuesday morning while Violet was finishing the last of her outside work before the heat settled in, and she listened to him completely, the way principled women listen, without interruption, without expression, without giving anything away until he had finished saying everything he had come to say. The offer was substantial, structured to sound straightforward, the kind of number designed to feel like relief rather than a transaction. When he finished, she thanked him politely for his time, went inside, and called Claire before his truck had reached the gate. Claire picked up on the second ring. Mom, everything all right? A man came to the ranch this morning, Violet said. Solar company. He had an offer. Claire straightened slightly. What company? Violet gave the name, and the line went quiet in a way that told her everything before Claire said another word. The particular silence of a daughter who knows something her mother doesn't yet and is deciding how to say it. Mom, Claire said carefully, that's the same company Wyatt's been dealing with. Violet absorbed that without rushing. I thought something was off about him, she said. What do you mean? Claire asked. His shoes, Violet said simply. Too clean. Claire arrived at Violet's ranch within the hour, sitting across from her mother at the kitchen table with the SIG offer laid flat between them, while the morning heat built steadily outside, explaining everything. The original term sheet, the interconnection filing, the planning objections, the doubled lease offer, the visit to the ranch. And Violet listened the way she always listened, in full and without interruption, her eyes moving between her daughter's face and the offer on the table. When Claire finished, Violet sat quietly for a moment. So they came here because Wyatt said no, she said. Claire nodded. They think your land gives them another angle. Violet looked at the offer on the table without touching it. And does it? Claire shook her head slowly. Not if you don't want it to. Violet stood and put the kettle on, moving around her kitchen with the unhurried ease of a woman who had made every significant decision in her life at this same table. And when she sat back down, she folded the offer close without reading it again. "Call Wyatt," she said. "Tell him I'd like to understand what he's building." Claire smiled. "He'll want to explain it himself," she said. Violet nodded. "Good," she said. "That's how it should be." Outside, the morning heat had settled fully across both ranches, steady and without argument, and somewhere along the boundary between Violet's ground and Wyatt's caliche pasture, the orange survey flags moved slowly in the wind, marking the edge of something that was already decided. Wyatt drove over to Violet's ranch the following morning, arriving early while the air was still cool, and they sat together at her kitchen table while he explained everything. The caliche ground, the transmission corridor, the interconnection filing, the battery storage, what 160 megawatt hours meant for timing and control and the future of both ranches. Violet listened the way she always listened, fully and without interruption, asking 2 questions when he finished that told him she had understood everything the first time through. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking at the map he had spread across her kitchen table. "I have caliche ground too," she said. Wyatt nodded. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "How much would it run?" Wyatt gave her the number honestly, the way he gave her everything, directly and without softening it. And Violet absorbed it without flinching, the way a woman who had run a ranch alone for decades absorbs a significant number, measuring it against what she knew and what she had and what it would mean going forward. "I don't have that sitting around," she said. Wyatt looked at her calmly. "I do," he said, "and I'd like to put it in." Violet studied him for a long moment. "That's a considerable thing to offer," she said. "It's a considerable piece of ground you've been sitting on without knowing it," Wyatt replied. The conversation that followed was practical and unhurried, the way conversations at that table had always been. 2 people who understood land and obligation and the long view that ranching requires working through the details without drama. Violet's caliche ground was a third the size of Wyatt's, but still formidable, still capable of generating power that would tie into the same battery storage system and feed the same transmission corridor south toward Midland. Connected, the 2 installations would operate as a single energy platform across both ranches, stronger together than either would be on its own. When they had worked through everything that needed working through, Wyatt looked across the table at her. "So," he said quietly, "what do you think?" Violet was quiet for a moment, her hands flat on the table, looking at the map the way she looked at everything that mattered. Steadily and without rushing toward a conclusion before the thinking was done. Then she nodded once. "I think yes," she said. They brought it to Wyatt's kitchen table that evening, the whole story laid out for Claire and Annie while the supper dishes sat to one side and the maps took their usual place across the worn timber surface. Claire listened with the particular stillness she brought to things that moved her, and Annie asked 3 precise, practical questions and told everyone in the room that she had already been thinking about this possibility before it was proposed. Violet sat across from Wyatt at the end of the table, and when everything had been said and the questions had been answered, she looked at him directly. "I want one condition," she said. Wyatt waited. "You take everything my installation produces," she said, "until every dollar you put in comes back to you. All of it. I won't hear another arrangement." Wyatt started to speak. Violet raised a hand slightly. "That's not a negotiation, Wyatt. That's the condition." The kitchen was quiet for a moment, Claire watching her husband, Annie watching Violet, the wind moving softly outside across the pasture where the survey flags had long since been replaced by the first survey stakes of the actual installation. Wyatt looked at Violet for a moment, then nodded once. "All right," he said. He extended his hand across the table. Violet took it without hesitation. No term sheet, no governance language, no 40 pages of dense structure designed to be agreed to rather than understood. A handshake at a kitchen table between 2 people who had known each other long enough to know that some agreements don't require anything more than that. Claire looked at her mother, then at her husband, and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. Annie rested her arms on the table and smiled slightly in the way she smiled when something was settled in a way that couldn't be improved upon. Outside, the wind moved steadily across two ranches and two areas of caliche ground that had produced nothing for generations. And somewhere along the boundary between them, the transmission towers stood on the southern horizon exactly where they had always stood, patient and unnoticed, waiting for someone to understand what they meant. Two families had understood now. SIG came back on the morning the solar farm switched on. Nobody had invited them. Nobody had expected them. But the black truck rolled slowly down the 4-mile track just as the sun was clearing the eastern horizon, and Wyatt watched it come from the porch with his coffee in his hand and said nothing for a moment. Claire appeared beside him. "Same truck," she said. Wyatt nodded. "Same boots, probably." He set his coffee down and walked out to meet them. The switch-on had been planned for that morning, with the whole team gathering on the western pasture as the installation crew ran their final checks across the panel rows that now stretched across the caliche ground in long, patient lines from the ranch boundary south toward the transmission corridor. Daniel stood near the battery housing, a tablet in hand, running through the final sequence of the commissioning process. Annie stood beside Jake near the interconnection panel, the same panel that Wyatt had filed for before Sig understood what was happening. Violet had driven over before sunrise, standing now near Claire at the edge of the pasture, looking out across ground that had bordered her own ranch her entire life without ever producing anything worth looking at. The installation crew ran their final checks quietly and professionally, and the morning air was still cool enough to be comfortable. Somewhere beneath the caliche ground, the foundations of the battery housing sat deep and solid in the hardpan that 3 generations of ranchers had cursed for not growing grass. It was growing something now. The 2 SIG men walked out across the pasture toward the gathering, and the taller one looked around at the panel rows, the battery housing, and the interconnection infrastructure with an expression that moved briefly through several stages before settling into something that was almost respect. Almost. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "we wanted to make one final offer before the project went fully live." Wyatt looked at him without particular expression. "You've come a long way for a conversation that's already finished," he said. The man continued anyway, the number he offered landing in the morning air between them, larger than anything Sig had proposed before. The kind of figure that represented a genuine recalibration of what the company now understood Wyatt's land to be worth. Wyatt let the number sit for a moment. Then he looked out across the caliche ground. When he spoke, it wasn't to the Sig men specifically, or not only to them, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has thought about something for a long time and has finally found the moment to say it completely. "My grandfather broke this ground in 1931, he said. He plowed it and seeded it and watched it come up thin 3 years running before he accepted that the caliche layer beneath it wasn't going to change its nature because he needed it to. He worked around it the way you work around something you can't fix. You fence it off, you factor it into your carrying capacity, you accept the loss, and you move on." He paused, looking south toward the transmission towers. "My father inherited that same acceptance. He knew every section of this ranch the way a doctor knows a patient. The strong ground and the weak ground, the reliable grass and the ground that failed in a dry year, and that western pasture failed more often than it didn't. In the drought of 1980, we lost 3 months of grazing from that section alone, and he had to make decisions about the herd that cost him sleep for years afterwards, selling cattle he'd bred carefully because the ground wouldn't carry them through." He turned slightly toward the battery housing. "I mortgaged this ranch in 1994. Drought came in hard that spring, and the western pasture produced nothing worth putting cattle on, and the feed costs to carry the herd through winter nearly broke what 3 generations had built. I sat at that kitchen table with the bank papers in front of me, and I thought about my grandfather plowing caliche in 1931, and my father watching cattle lose condition in 1980, and I wondered what the point was of ground that took everything you gave it and returned nothing back." The morning was very quiet now, the installation crew standing still, Daniel with his tablet at his side, Annie and Jake near the interconnection panel, Claire and Violet at the edge of the pasture. "I have walked that western section my entire life, knowing it would never graze well," Wyatt continued, his voice steady and unhurried. I have seeded it and fertilized it, and accepted its failure as a fact of this ranch, the way my father accepted it and his father before him. 3 generations of Callahans carrying ground that never carried us back. He looked directly at the SIG man now. You came here with a term sheet and a lease offer, and a plan to take that ground from me for a fraction of what it was worth, because you understood something about it that I didn't yet. And I'll give you this. You were right about the ground. You just underestimated the man standing on it. He gestured toward Violet. Her family carried caliche ground too. A third the size of mine, but the same story. The same thin grass. The same dry years. The same quiet acceptance that some ground just doesn't work. 2 ranches, 2 families. 3 generations each carrying dead ground that was waiting for someone to understand what it actually was. He looked back at the panel rows stretching across the western pasture. It wasn't dead ground. It was the wrong use of good ground. And the difference between those 2 things is what's standing in front of you this morning. Daniel looked up from his tablet. We're ready, he said quietly. Wyatt nodded without looking away from the southern horizon. Go ahead, he said. The commissioning sequence ran silently through its final stages, and then the monitoring display on Daniel's tablet shifted from amber to green, and somewhere in the battery housing the first stored charge registered against the system, and the transmission corridor south toward Midland received the first signal from Wyatt Callahan's interconnection point, and 160 megawatt hours of storage capacity began filling with West Texas sunlight falling on caliche ground that had never produced anything worth the keeping until this particular morning. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Annie said quietly, It's running. The SIG men stood at the edge of the pasture, looking out across the panel rows in the morning light, and the taller one was quiet for a long time before he spoke. That was some ground to carry, he said finally. Wyatt looked at him. Yes, he said simply. It was. The man nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression that had nothing to do with the offer he had come to make, and he looked out across the caliche ground one more time before turning back toward the truck. There was nothing left to negotiate. There was nothing left to offer. The ground had been decided, the filing had been made, the handshake had been given, and the system was running, and all the term sheets in all the boardrooms in Texas couldn't change any of that now. They shook hands before they left, briefly and without ceremony, and Wyatt watched the black truck roll back down the 4-mile track until it disappeared where the ranch met the road. Then he turned back toward his family. Claire was standing beside Violet at the edge of the pasture, both of them looking out across the panel rows with the particular expression of women who have been patient through something difficult and are now watching it resolve the way they always believed it would. Annie stood near the battery housing with Jake, already talking through the monitoring dashboard with the focused attention she brought to everything that mattered, while Daniel made notes on his tablet with the quiet satisfaction of an engineer watching something he designed perform exactly as he calculated it would. Max, Jake's Dutch shepherd, sat beside Jake without moving, watching the pasture the way he watched everything, fully and without distraction. Wyatt walked back across the caliche ground toward them, the morning sun warm on his shoulders now, the cool air of early morning beginning to give way to the steady heat that West Texas builds through the day without drama or announcement. He stopped beside Claire and looked out across the rows of panels. She took his hand without looking at him. The western pasture had never looked like this before. It had never caught light the way it did now, the panel surfaces moving it quietly into the battery housing, and from there into the transmission corridor, and from there into the grid that fed the drilling operations and the towns and industries south of the ranch toward Midland. The caliche ground that had defeated every seed his grandfather planted, that had failed his father in the drought of 1980, that had driven Wyatt to the bank with mortgage papers in 1994, was producing now with a consistency and a reliability that no rainfall pattern and no grass variety and no amount of ranching patience had ever managed to deliver from that ground. It produced in drought, it produced in heat, it produced in the thin winter light when the grass that did grow elsewhere on the ranch went dormant, and the cattle needed feeding, and the old anxiety of the low-yield years would have begun building in a rancher's chest like weather coming in from the west. It would not build anymore. Not from that ground. Not from Violet's ground either. Her caliche acres now tied into the same system, feeding the same storage, earning back every dollar Wyatt had put in on a timeline that Annie had calculated with the same precision she brought to everything. And when that last dollar came back, the income would belong entirely to Violet and the ranch next door that Claire's family had held through their own version of the same difficult years. 2 ranches, 1 system. Ground that had carried nothing for 3 generations was carrying everything now. In the years that followed, Wyatt did not become a solar developer, an energy executive, or anything that required clean boots and conference rooms. He remained what he had always been, a rancher who read land in inches and understood the long patience that working ground requires. But the team around that kitchen table became something more than a response to SIG's pressure, Daniel's engineering, and Annie's legal architecture, and Jake's technical integration, forming the basis of a capability that other ranchers began calling about quietly. Word moving through the cattle association, the way word always moved in that country. Slowly, carefully, and only after someone trusted had said it was worth the conversation. Wyatt financed 8 more installations in the years that followed, each on caliche ground nobody had found a use for, each tied into the same transmission infrastructure his original filing had secured, each representing another ranching family freed from the particular anxiety of ground that took everything and returned nothing. The team worked the way good teams work. Jake handling the technical integration, Daniel the engineering, Annie the legal and financial architecture, Wyatt the conversations that only happen between men who understand what it costs to carry bad ground through a bad year. It was not a solar company that ran cattle ranches. It was something closer to the opposite, a ranching operation that had found a way to make the worst ground on every property its most reliable asset, and in doing so had changed what it meant to hold land in that part of Texas through the difficult years that always came eventually, because the difficult years always came eventually. And the difference now was that when they came, the caliche ground kept producing regardless. The worry that had lived in the background of 3 generations of ranching decisions, the feed costs, the drought calculations, the quiet arithmetic of carrying capacity against rainfall against market prices, did not disappear entirely, because ranching never loses all of its difficulty, and a man who tells you otherwise hasn't ranched long enough. But it breathed differently now. It sat lighter. It arrived in dry years, and Wyatt noted it the way he noted everything, in inches and small imbalances. And then he looked at the monitoring dashboard on the tablet by his morning coffee and watched the western pasture producing in the same steady, reliable way it produced every day, regardless of what the sky was doing. And the arithmetic came out differently than it used to. It came out right. Claire found him on the porch one evening in the second year of the installation, the sun dropping low over the pasture the way it dropped in late summer, the light turning everything gold and unhurried the way West Texas light does when it decides to be beautiful. The panel rows were visible from the porch, catching the last of the day's sun before the storage system shifted into its evening holding pattern, waiting for the grid to need what it had accumulated through the long, bright hours of the day. She sat beside him without saying anything for a while. Then, "Your grandfather would have liked this," she said. Wyatt thought about that for a moment, about a man plowing caliche in 1931 and watching it come up thin and accepting the loss and moving on the way ranching people move on. Without drama, without complaint, with the particular resilience that the ground requires of the people who choose to work it. "He would have been angry it took this long," Wyatt said. Claire smiled. "That too," she said. The sun dropped below the western horizon, and the panel rows went still, and the battery housing held what the day had made, and the transmission corridor south toward Midland carried the signal that said the power was there and ready and waiting for the moment it was needed. And on the ranch next door, Violet's installation held the same quiet charge against the same evening sky, and somewhere along the boundary between the 2 properties, the ground that had produced nothing for 3 generations of 2 families, produced on without pause or drama or any particular awareness of what it had taken to arrive at this particular evening on this particular porch with this particular view of a western pasture that had finally, after everything, earned its keep.